Hello, welcome to the panel, everyone. So we've heard already this morning how a wide range of different organizations are coming together to explore how to collect, share, and use data to solve a variety of real-world challenges, whether that's looking to drive innovation in healthcare, respond to the pandemic and national disasters, or to fight corruption and adapt to a changing climate. Many of these collaborations and initiatives are leading to the creation of new institutions to provide independent stewardship around data. But these collaborations are working in different sectors, to different timescales, and in different areas. Some are working on local problems, some national, some international. So given that variety, how do we design the right kinds of collaborations or institution to help address these different challenges? What choices do we need to make in order to ensure that we've got the right kind of governance and organizational structures in place? So that's a big topic, but we're hoping to unpick some of those issues in the panel today. And I'm going to be joined by Sonia Kapoor from Microsoft and Astha Kapoor from the Aapti Institute. So welcome both of you to the panel. I'm going to ask you both to introduce yourself and a bit about the work that you do. So Sonia, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sonia Kapoor. I'm a patent attorney at Microsoft in the Open Innovation team. I work very closely with Microsoft Research in Cambridge, working on a number of technologies that are relevant to data collaboration, like confidential computing and multi-policy machine learning. Back in April, Microsoft launched the Open Data campaign in partnership with the ODI to help close the data divide, which I've been very closely involved with. Around the world, more data is being produced than ever before and playing a more important role than ever before. However, there is a looming data divide. The organizations that actually have access to that data are limited. In fact, 50% of online interactions and the data generated from those only flows to about 100 companies in the whole world. And so part of our efforts in the Open Data campaign is to ensure that the benefits of data and data collaboration can actually be enjoyed by everyone. And so we are going to be supporting at least 20 data collaborations by 2022 with the aim of demonstrating the value of the outcomes that you can achieve and actually collaborate and share around data. We're also share the learnings from those data collaborations as widely as possible so that people are able to make use of our learnings. And so I'm still very much on a learning curve with these data collaborations, but hopefully I'll be able to share some of the insights I've collected so far today.
Thank you, Sonia. I'm very happy to be working with you as part of that initiative. So Astha, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. So I'm Astha. I'm the co-founder of Aapti Institute, and we are a public research institution based out of Bangalore, India, and we work at the intersection of tech and society, and our objective is to examine this space from the perspective of the lived experience. We've been working on data stewardship and started looking at it as, first we define it as a way to unlock the value of data, similar to just said, but while safeguarding rights of people whose data it is. And we think of it as a way to, again, in the same sort of vein as Sonia, a way to rebalance power in the data economy. And we take a problem-led, use case-based approach. So we're trying to figure out what are the sectors that are sort of prime for stewardship, where it can be unlocked, who are the stakeholders, and trying to explore different aspects such as questions of governance, technology, third-party access, and trying to understand what this means both theoretically, but also in a more functional way. And we're putting all of this work in a space that we're building called the Data Economy Lab, which we think will be a sort of hub to think and experiment and test ideas on stewardship across different sectors. So, yeah.
Great, thanks very much. So one of the things I wanted to do to kick the session off is in the discussion in the earlier sessions, there's been mention of a range of different types of stewardship model. People have referred to data co-ops, data unions, data trusts, and a whole variety of other different forms. Now, I know that's something that you've been looking at, Astha, as part of some of your stewardship work. Are you able to give us a bit of a summary of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we went through over 100 use cases to understand what the different characteristics of each of these models were, and we decided that there were two access. And I mean, it's a complex world. There are a lot of different overlapping definitions. There's confusion about what each of these models is and what they can be called, because everybody is using their own vocabulary. So what we did is we tried to align the taxonomy, and we did this by defining two axes. One is what the steward does with the data, so it whether it just sort of stocks it, whether it allows it to just flow through, or whether it does both. And on the other axis, we thought about who the sort of main decision maker is. Is it the individual? Is it a third party, or is it a legally defined trustee in the case of data trusts? And through that, we thought that there were four broad categories of data stewards. One was account aggregators, which I'm beginning to realize is perhaps peculiar to India, which is a data blind, just sort of data flow mechanism. We found there were collaboratives, personal data stores, and then data trusts broadly. So those were the four categories that we thought were distinct. And of course, other models such as cooperatives, etc., can fall within these four models in some ways. So that's what we did to define the landscape, but also recognize the fact that this is a very fast moving space. And a lot of these definitions may be in some ways dated because of how quickly some of the structures are moving.
That's very helpful. Thank you. So I guess question to both of you really. I mean, what's the first step? I mean, if there are a range of different types of governance models and legal structures, how do we get started? Do we focus on design and organization, or are there some initial steps that we need to think about? Sonia, what do you think?
So it might sound obvious, but I think the first step is to actually focus on the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, the challenges that you address through the collaboration. It ensures that the relations are engaged, that you are thinking about the right data that can be shared, and that it can be shared in a way that you need to use it. And I think it's also one thing that you actually need to keep in mind throughout the collaboration, in case you do need to rescope the output collaboration. And I think in focusing on the output, that ensures that the parties involved are all able to understand what their role is, as well as what value there is for each individual organisation that's collaborating. I think starting there then gives you the flexibility, being able to actually design the approach.
Yeah, great. Astha, would you?
Yeah, I mean, I entirely agree. I think the starting point has to be what is the need and purpose for the collaboration? Who are the stakeholders involved? Like Sonia said, what are the considerations? What sort of like regulatory landscape does this collaboration exist in is also critical. What types of data is it looking to steward? Because different types of data will be regulated differently. And then, as Sonia said, we can get into the questions of like, how do you then govern? And I would like to believe that the process should be made as consultative as possible to involve all the stakeholders involved, so that it can then build it in a way that there's buy-in all across, and should be in some ways to refer to the sort of Sylvie Delacroix, Neil Lawrence paper, which is there should be an element of it being bottom up in a certain way. So yeah.
Okay, so the first step then is to really focus on building that understanding of shared purpose. That seems quite challenging to do, though, given the range of different stakeholders, because in some cases we're talking about institutions that are collecting and stewarding personal data, and in some cases it's about intermediaries that are sharing data across companies. Have you seen any good models for that kind of engagement, or some good practice that you'd highlight? I'm happy for it.
I think that, I mean, at least from everything that we've seen, the space seems to be quite nascent. While there are, collaborations between companies, etc. I think the question of what is a good data steward and something that we'd like to replicate still remains. So the examples exist, but there's nothing that comes to mind that I would think of as an exceptional example that sort of like pulls together all the big principles such as accountability, transparency, participation that we've been thinking about in our work, because we feel like stewardship has such a huge opportunity to do so much good and create a huge amount of value, but also can, is at risk of capture, misinterpretation. So we need to put together a set of like principles that all stewards must comply to in a certain way, have a common minimum in some shape or form, and then go from there to create models that that we can support.
Yeah, interesting. So Sonia, how does that reflect with some of the projects that you've been involved with?
Yes, I don't think that you'll find a one size fits all governance. Thinking about, as I said, going back to the outcomes is really important in being able to not identify the common reason as to why each of the parties are involved, but identify the outcomes that you want to achieve. And the governance structures will depend on the level of complexity of the data that's being shared and the analysis that needs to be done. If there's a low level of trust between parties, or if there's particularly sensitive that's being, there are also technical means by can share data to ensure that that data isn't exposed to third parties, but you can still commonly share data to train a common machine learning model so that the insights are shared between the relevant stakeholders. So I think it very much depends on the data and the context and the scenario that you're trying to fit.
Okay, so there's a whole range of complex factors then that we have to consider. But are there do you think there are strengths and weaknesses of different organization models, collaborative models for different types of data or different approaches?
So I think if you're firstly understanding what the outcomes are, who the stakeholders are, what they each bring to the collaboration, where the skills are. So say, for example, your outcome is in relation to maybe addressing issues that relate to childhood asthma in a particular location, ensuring that either amongst the collaborators or perhaps through third-party feedback engagement, you have expert input into how to actually scope that collaboration. Then identifying early on the data that can be shared, the issues around sharing that data, what the risks are. And I think once you've actually mapped out, then you can think about the different structures that you need to apply to that, and what the best fit is. But it's difficult to say out of context.
Okay.
Sorry, if I may just jump in, but only to agree that, I mean, I think that it's exactly what Sonia is saying, and that's what I meant when I said, like, we're also trying to take a problem-led approach, which is that what is the purpose of the steward in a way, and then each steward makes a set of choices, or design choices as we're calling them, about how the data is going to be structured, what are the sort of governance mechanisms, etc. What sort of access third parties have, what level of participation needs to be given, or the stakeholders must have. So each model in that sense is unique. And there are, there are a certain set of like best practices that could emerge out of this in some ways, but they may not be applicable across, because so much of it is determined by the purpose of the steward. So for instance, an account aggregator in the context of India is just supposed to be a data flow, and it's data blind and does not necessarily, it's just a consent manager, so to speak. Whereas a cooperative that is a data cooperative that is actively seeking to, create societal value is going to be structured very, very differently. So, yeah, I mean, only to echo what Sonia is saying, that the purpose of the steward defines everything around it, and therefore it's very hard to sort of evaluate one against the other.
Okay. So I'm digging into that point a little bit more, and I'm picking up a question that's coming from the audience. If we need to do some engagement early on to make sure that we've designed the right kind of governance, how do we adapt to the fact that the needs of the short-term needs of perhaps the first group of stakeholders we engage with may be different to those that are going to be benefiting from or participating in the institution over the longer term? So how can we build in, I guess, some flexibility, or so the governance can change, or should it be more restrictive, and that if needs change, then we need to go back to the drawing board?
I mean, just sort of based on everything that we've been reading and thinking about, is I think that a flexible governance model might be more useful. And I'm unclear on what it would look like, but I think that constant consultative processes should be embedded in the governance model, so as to deal with issues that, or we have new stakeholders coming in, or something is changing in terms of the purpose, new people are wanting to, I don't know, there's a greater market for the data that's being stewarded. So all of those questions need to be dynamic, and I don't think that any steward can be successful in whatever its purpose is if the governance structure doesn't allow for dynamic decision making in a certain way.
Okay.
Yeah. I'd also add, actually, that in addition to thinking about governance, what can be helpful if you do need to be flexible in your approach to governance is actually, at the outset, agreeing a set of principles under which you are establishing the collaboration. So Microsoft published 5 principles to share essentially how we would approach data collaboration, and essentially they boil down to being open as possible with that data or the insights. And I think once you have that common understanding amongst the stakeholders, then it becomes easier to see whether the changes in governance still fit within the set of principles that you agreed.
Yeah, so you've got that, you use the principles as the guiding light then to help shape that evolution. Okay, that's useful. I'm going to try and take another question or two from the audience. We had a question come in to say, are either of you aware of collaborations or institutions that involve sharing of data between management and employees or workers more broadly? Is that something?
So there are some efforts that are coming up. I saw something called WeClock. So WeClock, what it's trying to do is, it's an alternative form of collecting data on worker issues. So how much time it takes for people to reach their job, or whatever, how much time they're spending, what is leisure, all of that. So it becomes an alternative repository of worker data, and that can then be used by unions or any sort of representatives of workers to negotiate better with the employers. Similarly, there's another cooperative called Driver's Seat, which is also trying to collect worker data, but it's doing that in part to negotiate, but also then to sort of sell that sort of driver's data, from what I understand, to city governments or researchers, and then distribute value back to the drivers. So, so in one part, negotiation, in another part, trying to create additional value for workers or drivers in this case. And it's something that we've been thinking about as well, is what is the role of giving workers, particularly those in the platform economy, greater control over their data, and doing that through some version of a steward, so that, because in this context, they can then possibly have greater control of their data and then use it to negotiate better with the companies.
Thank you. Sonia, is there any initiatives that you might be familiar with?
No, not that I'm familiar with or have worked on.
Okay. So the other question we've had come in is around the role of institutions and intermediaries in helping to reduce digital exclusion. So do you think there is the right kind of institutional model and governance can help address those kind of issues? Sonia, did you want to give us some thoughts on that?
So I guess I hadn't really thought of it in the context of how governance can impact that area, but more how the outcomes of data collaborations can actually drive solutions in that area. So, for example, we have an airband project that essentially identifies areas that have poor broadband connectivity and provide additional resources there. And obviously that identification of areas that have poor broadband connectivity is relies on data analysis. So that would be an outcome potentially of a data collaboration, but I can't think of how it might fit into a governance solution.
Okay, thank you. Astha, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there's, and maybe this is sort of related to what Sonia was saying, is also that, you know, in a certain way, if data is power, then those who control it is, you know, that can, again, like bargain for better conditions, more inclusion, etc. So, for instance, in the context of India, one of the things we're saying is that informal sector or migrant workers, there's not a lot of data about them. Even though this data exists, it's not being deployed to you know, reach better service delivery to the vulnerable. So a steward in this case could work on behalf of certain communities, such as, you know, I don't know, urban migrants or people working in a certain geography, etc. And, you know, steward the data, make it more accessible, make it, you know, safe to, and negotiate with the government to ensure better services. So I think that in terms of inclusion, I think that stewards have an extremely important role to play because they can make data accessible, they can help vulnerable groups negotiate better with the government, the private sector, whoever else. So, yeah.
Thank you. So we only have a few minutes left, and there are unfortunately quite a lot of questions from the audience, so we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But there's obviously a lot of interest in how we go about doing making these design choices and doing this engagement, so we end up with the right kind of governance models. So I think to perhaps bring the discussion to a conclusion, I'm wondering whether you can, both of you, give us some pointers to resources that might be helpful for people who want to dig into this in more detail. Sonia, I gather you've been collecting some useful resources and tools as part of the Microsoft project.
Yes, so Microsoft's Open Data Campaign has a microsite, which hopefully the link will be shared for, but essentially it links to resources and technologies, and also includes some sample data sharing agreements that are essentially templates that are suited to various data sharing scenarios that will hopefully be useful for some data sharing scenarios. We have seen that the legal barriers are often the ones that cause the most delay in these data collaborations being set up.
Thank you. Astha, was it resources that you've found useful?
Yeah, I mean, we've obviously learned a lot from ODI's work, which I would also point to. But you know, we are also building, like I said, a hub for thinking and reading and writing around data stewardship. So that's at a microsite called the Data Economy Lab. And in terms of other resources, I also found GovLab's work very, very helpful in thinking about, like Sonia said, some of the data sharing agreements, thinking about what kind of capacities are required, which I would also point people towards.
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the themes of this discussion and some of the things I took from the earlier panels is that there isn't going to be an off-the-shelf solution necessarily to to data institutions, it has to be designed and tuned to the specific purpose that we're trying to achieve. But it does sound like there's a lot of learning that we can do across initiatives, a lot of sharing of resources. I like the idea of drawing on more templated legal agreements as a way to try and navigate some of those discussions. It also feels like a strong peer network of sharing learning across some of the early organizations who are exploring these questions would be a good thing to invest in. And hopefully some of the discussion in the chat today has been helpful in doing that. So I think those are my final kind of questions to you. I just wanted to give you both a chance, just if there's anything else you want to kind of leave people with as a kind of takeaway, perhaps a bit of advice or a key starting point. Sonia?
So I've said it before, but I'd say that the key piece of advice, at least that I've learned, is to focus on the outcomes and the value of those outcomes.
Thank you. And Astha?
Yeah, I mean, I also agree. I think outcomes, and I think as a community of people thinking about this, we need to test more of these models, see what they look like, try to arrange them in different ways, because there'll be so many different outcomes that we want to generate out of data stewardship or collaborations. And I guess in the way that Sonia is talking about, 20 collaborations, etc., we need to do more of that work before it becomes codified in policy. And in the case of India, data trusts are already being mentioned in some of the writing coming out of the government. So the need to test this now before sort of half informed ideas become part of legal structures that we have to deal with then over time.
Thank you. So to I think wrap up the session, I want to thank you both for your time this afternoon and sharing some of your experience. Thank you to the audience for the questions. I look forward to continuing the discussion with you all in the chat for the rest of the afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.